Okay, Bershus Avimori, my family, my friends, Rabbanim Chashuvim, Moranim Rabbanim Barabosai. I have been given the great. Can you hear me? I've been given the great zichus and the awesome responsibility of emceeing today's Shloshim, commemorating or marking 30 days since the passing of Adoni Zikni Mori Rabbi, Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld, Mordechai Shraga Feifel, Ben Shmuel Shapse Halevi. And in keeping with our wishes to respect Kavod HaMeis and my grandfather's wishes, we are going to keep a tight program today. But the truth is, however long we would speak, a minute, an hour, a week, a year, nothing would ever suffice to be able to pay tribute to this Sar V'Gadol Shenafal B'Yisrael. Now, today's Shloshim, of course, is about my grandfather, but I can't speak about him without at least taking note and mention of my grandmother, Aleh HaShalom, Rachel Basar Shalom, whose yahrzeit was just a few weeks ago. My grandparents were partners, true partners in life, and everything that my grandfather accomplished, he owed in large part to the support of my beloved grandma. And I remember a few years ago at a shul event, my grandfather spoke so beautifully. He said, he gave a great mashal. He said, before Ruth came into my life, I was a machatzis hashekel. She joined me, and together we formed the Shekel HaKodesh. And interestingly enough, among the sprawling meadow that makes up our Schonfeld Schindelheim extended family includes a Gita Kapel, who was a sister of sorts, both literally and figuratively, to both my grandfather and to his brother, Uncle Bibi, who was nifter just a few days before my grandfather. And in fact, Gita was largely responsible for forming that union, the union between Rabbi and Rebbitzin, Fabian and Ruth Schonfeld, Aleh HaShalom. And so we as a family and as a community are grateful not only for her love and support as a member of our family and sharing her mother with us for many years, but for her role in creating the force that we are commemorating here today. My grandfather was a very, very diverse person, as anybody who knew him knows. He had his hands and feet in many different worlds. He was a Talmud of the Rav. He was a close Yedid Nemun of Rav Aaron Kotler, who was an ideological adversary of the Rav in many ways. He was a Chassid, he was a Litvak, he was a Misnagid, he was a Zionist, and he was an Atura Kartanik all at the same time. All of which and none of which at the same time. At his Levaya, we were restrained both by halachic considerations and practical considerations. It was Hanukkah, and of course, given the pandemic, the Levaya was limited. There were two Maspidim, both Hasidish Rabbanim, Talmid Chachamim, Anoshim Chashuvim in their own right, Rabbi Olbaum, and my uncle, my great uncle, Grand Rebbe Shlita. And today we will hear from members of other Shvatim in Klal Yisrael that my grandfather was equally devoted to and a member of. For many years, of course, Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld was a powerhouse in the Young Israel movement. He took great pride in the fact that he was president of the RCA. He spent a number of years as a member of the Vada Musmachim in Yeshiva University. He has been referred to, certainly in his later years, as the rabbi's rabbi, a person of great accomplishment, of great leadership, of great authority. But as much as he was a rabbi in his heart and in his soul and in his legacy, he was equally, if not more so, a Talmud. In fact, that was his ultimate defining characteristic, a Talmud first and foremost of his father, my great-grandfather Shmuel Shapse Halevi Schonfeld, who was a great influence on him, a Talmud of the writings and the philosophies of Hirsch, of the Admorei Gord, in particular Beis Yisrael, and of course the Sfas Emes, who he had a great bikiyas in the writings of the Sfas Emes. My grandfather told the story how he went to see the Beis Yisrael when the shidduch of my grandmother was proposed, and he was in such awe and such fear he couldn't get the words out. I've had the schus of being with him at occasion when he visited the Pnei Menachem Zechrono Livracha and saw the humility that he had. And for those interested, there's a short video clip of him on YouTube visiting the Lubavitcher Rebbe some 30 years ago. And you see how he stood there almost like a child, so humble, despite the fact that he was such a great man in his own right. But of course, among others, above others, and above all else, my grandfather was a Talmud of Rabbi Yashaber Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. And I think that his unqualified, unbridled, unquestioning devotion to his Rebbeim, and in particular the Rav, was the ingredient that made him so effective as a leader. He taught us, he taught the family, his extended family of the community of Kew Gardens Hills, and the extended family of Klal Yisrael. He taught us not only how to lead, but how to follow. He taught us that the importance, that an ingredient of a great leader is to be an even greater follower. And he was so devoted, so übergegeben to his Rebbe, Rabbi Yashaber Soloveitchik, for his entire life. And I can be made that at least I cannot recall a single time where my grandfather spoke, darshan, gave a shir, without mentioning the Rav. I'm not saying it never happened. I can't recall that ever happening. In his later years, I would take my son Shirley to visit him at home, and they would invariably end up talking and learning. He would say, "What are you learning?" Tell him, "I'm learning this Masechta, that Masechta," and the next thing you know, we're hearing, the Rav said this, the Rav said that. Rabbi Yashaber Soloveitchik was the guiding light and the greatest force in his life, and he was a true Talmud of the Rav. And that, I think, was his hallmark. He was able to be such a great leader because he was such a great follower. His greatest professional accomplishment, of course, was the creation, the nurturing, and the development of the Young Israel, and by extension, the community of Kew Gardens Hills. And I'm going to go against my better judgment and just mention a few, very few people over the years who had a direct hand in his Avodas HaKodesh, specifically Pearl Hammett, his secretary, who's no longer with us, and Susan Zimmelover, Bubby Sue, known to us. Our beloved Gabbai David Englander, who served so devotedly and continues to do so, along with Yosef Pavlek and Dr. Levinson, and of course Richie Spira, Baal Priya, and so many others, board members, presidents, lay people who were devoted to the shul, devoted to him, all of whom had a hand in creating this extraordinary kahila congregation and community that continues to this day to be his lasting legacy. And so on that note, it is my privilege to call upon the current president of the Young Israel Kew Garden Hills, Mr. Stuart Verstendig, to say a few words of Zikaron. Stu, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Simcha. Today we gather on Zoom to commemorate the Shloshim of our dear Rav, founding Rabbi of the Young Israel of Kew Garden Hills, Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, who served the Queens and national Jewish community for nearly 7 decades. We miss him. Rabbi Schonfeld served his rabbinic role with total dedication for each member of our Young Israel. The concern, warmth for each person he knew cannot be measured. The thousands of lives he touched was remarkable. Building the Young Israel of Kew Garden Hills and the Kew Garden Hills community is due to his undertaking, vision, and leadership. In addition to the local community, Rabbi Schonfeld held leadership positions in rabbinical organizations and the greater Jewish community, and was thereby able to spread Torah values, defend Jews in danger, and advocate for a secure state of Israel. His weekly Shabbos drasha often included his love for Eretz Yisrael, the Rav, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, and the Sfas Emes. And so today, in the observance of the Shloshim, we pause to listen to the words of his family and our rabbinic and Jewish communal leaders with whom he had a close relationship. May his neshama be an inspiration for all of us. May the teachings and lessons of his leadership be part of our daily lives.
Thank you. It is difficult for me, if not inappropriate for me, to introduce the next speaker. As who am I to introduce the Gadol B'Yisrael? But nonetheless, as I said, and as Stuart just said, my grandfather was such dedicated and devoted Talmud of the Rav, that there is no person more appropriate than the Rosh Hashiva of Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, Rav Hershel Schechter, who is carrying on the legacy of the Rav, and of course his own legacy, and who shared many conversations and discussions and occasions to work with my grandfather, and in service of their own Talmidim and in service of the Rav. And so it is my covenant to call upon the Rosh Hashiva Shlita Rav Hershel Schechter to say a few words.
Thank you. The Gemara says, even though Rabbi Schonfeld was almost 20 years older than me, I feel as if I was part of his chabura. They had a strong chabura, all of the Rabbanim in Queens. I remember I give a shir in Queens. I used to give a shir in Queens for over 20 years, till the COVID began. So they considered me an honorary member of their Vada Rabbanim of Queens. So I remember about 35 years ago, one of the Rabbanim made a Sheva Brachas, I think. So they invited me to come participate. I didn't speak, I just participated in the Sheva Brachas. So I really feel I was a member of their Chabura. This was, they were all older than me. Rabbi Schonfeld was almost 20 years old. He was old enough to be my father, but they were all very b'yedidus with each other and all very respectful of each other. The Chachamim tell us, I remember there was one Rabbi in the yeshiva who was a European who requested, I wasn't that close with him, he requested I should come and visit him on his deathbed in the hospital. He died a few days later. So I came to the hospital. Another Rebbe took me to the hospital. So the first thing is, he asks me, Mechila, that all the years that he was with me in the yeshiva, he never said hello to me. I wanted to wish him a good Yantav, a good York. He would always turn around. He would never say hello to me. So on his deathbed, that's the first thing he said. Then he gave me instructions, other things, what to do after he dies. So he asks me, Mechila, he says, what can I tell you? I'm a European and I'm much older than you. And they looked down on the Americans. Rabbi Schonfeld was very respectful of everyone, even though we were much younger than he was. And it's interesting, I remember when this whole group entered into the rabbinate, the whole group of the Chaverim, of the rabbinate there in Queens. At that time, Orthodoxy was on the downhill. There used to be two gigantic magazines, Life and Look. I forgot already which one. So one of them in the 1950s was going to write a whole article about Judaism in America. And they were only going to write about Reform and Conservative. The Orthodox were practically dead. They were taking them mechitzas in all the shuls. And the European Rabbanim, the Talmidei Chachamim, they continued to remain in the shuls without mechitzas. They needed a parnasa. They had no choice. So this group of young Rabbanim, including Rabbi Schonfeld Zichron Livracha and his Chaverim, they were all instructed by Rabbi Soloveitchik, you don't compromise on this. They were fighting a battle. They didn't know if they were going to win the battle. The likelihood was they were going to lose the battle. But Rabbi Soloveitchik said, you can't compromise. And I remember they were going to write that article without writing anything about the Orthodox, because the Orthodox were half dead. So someone kept on insisting to the one who's going to write the article, he should meet with Rabbi Soloveitchik. Meet with Rabbi Soloveitchik. So he did. And the whole article was only about Orthodox. And they had a picture of Mrs. Fink from Scranton benching Licht on the cover. Some of us remember the cover. That was a time that we needed respected and respectful young Rabbanim to win back the public, to bring them back to Orthodoxy. Now we have yeshivas all over, we have Orthodoxy, you have Daf Yomi, and you have everything today. But at that time, you didn't have any Daf Yomi, you didn't have any of this. And Rabbi Schonfeld was one of those Rabbanim who brought back Orthodoxy. I had occasion quite a few times to meet with Rabbi Schonfeld on different issues. I'll just mention one occasion. Must have been about 20 years ago. Some of the younger Rabbanim in the RCA prepared a Het Tameh Rabbanim. So I guess I must have been scheduled to speak at an RCA convention. So I came with the Hetamei Rabbanim. I didn't prepare it. I signed it and I showed it to Rabbi Schonfeld, but he liked to sign a law. So he said he can't sign a Hetamei Rabbanim. At his Chag HaSmicha, Rabbi Soloveitchik was always the main speaker. Dr. Belkin wasn't such a good public speaker. He would speak for 5-10 minutes and say Advar Torah, and then he would give over the podium to Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik would give a talk every Chag HaSmicha, a major address for at least an hour. And every time the Chag HaSmicha, I remember when I was in high school, we used to attend the Chag HaSmichas. So every time there was a Chag HaSmicha, it was a different drasha. So Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld tells me on his Chag HaSmicha, the Rav warned them, he gave instructions to the young Mismachim, don't you dare sign a fake Hetamei Rabbanim. At that time, they were European Rabbanim. Unfortunately, they're still now. They were not European. No, they're not European. There were a lot of European Rabbanim who would make a very superficial Hetamei Rabbanim, and they would get people to sign 1, 2, 3. So he said, don't you dare sign a Hetamei Rabbanim. If you do, if it's not authentic, don't consider yourself a Talmud of mine any longer. So Rabbi Schonfeld, this was an authentic Hetamei. I told him which Rabbanim put it together. They were reliable people. He said he doesn't want to sign a Hetamei Rabbanim. Rabbi Soloveitchik said, if you sign a Hetamei Rabbanim, don't consider yourself my Talmud. Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld was fond of saying over the Mishnah and Pirkei Avos, Chamisha Talmidim hoyu lo, the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the chief rabbi. What do you mean he had 5 Talmidim? I have more than 5 Talmidim. I have hundreds of Talmidim every year. I have another 30 students. I'm teaching in yeshiva over 50 years. I have more than Chamisha Talmidim. How can it be Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai only had 5? He said, no, the Mishnah, I think he said there's the name of Rabbi Soloveitchik. But it doesn't matter who said it. It's a good pshat. He said, Chamisha Talmidim, Gishvarana Talmidim. They followed everything the Rebbe said. Rabbi Schonfeld, like you say, was such a Talmud, or Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik wasn't there. This was 50 years after his Chag HaSmicha, and as if Rabbi Soloveitchik would be there, and he's warning him, don't you dare sign that Hetamei Rabbanim, or don't consider yourself my Talmud any longer. He was really a Talmud of Rabbi Soloveitchik in a very beautiful way. He was mevatel himself completely to Rabbi Soloveitchik and to the Rebbes also, to the Gerer Rebbes. Yehi Zichro Baruch has much more to say, but the time doesn't permit. Yehi Zichro Baruch.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Rav Shechter. Our next speaker is Rabbi Menachem Genek, who's the CEO of Kashrus in the OU, a Rav in his own right, a Mechaber Svarim, a Talmud, one of the few true Talmidim of the Rav, like Rav Shechter, my grandfather. And Rabbi Genek also worked with my grandfather in the professional, not only in the rabbinic context, but in the professional context during the course of my grandfather's work, directly and indirectly with the Orthodox Union. And so it is my kavod to call upon Rabbi Menachem Genek to say a few words.
I grew up in Forest Hills in Queens, so I know from close up, the kind of work that Rabbi Schonfeld did, because he really created the religious infrastructure for Queens, the Young Israel, the Vard of Queens. He was active in the early years of Yeshiva Central Queens, together with Rabbi Charney. So I speak both as a colleague, a young colleague, but also as an extraordinary beneficiary of all the many things that he did. And I wanted to share with you a few stories, 4 stories that he told me. Invariably, the stories always had some link back to the Rav. As was mentioned, he had a very, very close relationship with the Rav. The Rav admired him, indeed loved him. The Rav spoke when he became president of the Binkel Council. He spoke about him in the most endearing and loving way, with and he had a very, very high regard for him, and for good reason. He considered him not only a loyal Talmud, but a genuine Talmud in every respect in terms of the Rav's positions, his integrity, his ideology, and I intersected with Rabbi Schonfeld, as was mentioned, also through the OU. He was one of the leaders of the Rabbinical Council, not only as president, but he, together with Manny Holzer, were very, very active, especially in the Kashrus Commission. I remember traveling with them. This was when I first came to the OU. There was a slaughterhouse in Minneapolis, or in the vicinity of Minneapolis, Landis, that he and Rabbi Holzer were very involved in. The concern was just to make sure that the kosher meat was available at a reasonable price to, not just for his balabatim, but generally. So I want to share some of these stories. Rabbi Schonfeld once told me a story that Menachem Begin, this was prior to his becoming prime minister, was in New York, and he was staying in one of the hotels, and he wanted to meet with the Rav, two briskers. So Rabbi Schonfeld, and I think Rabbi Holzer was took him as well, drove him from the hotel to yeshiva, to YU, and the Rav was giving shir, and as was his wont, the shir extended and extended, and Menachem Begin, being the man of dignity that he was, didn't want, even though he came up special to be able to speak to the Rav and see him, he just looked through the window of the shir, and he didn't interrupt. He said, but unfortunately now I have to go back. So he left without having spoken to the Rav. And so Rabbi Schonfeld told me that during, and that trip, he asked Menachem Begin, what was it that made him such a gibor, such a man of such strength and purpose? So Begin told him this story, that as a child, he must have been 8 or 9 years old. He was walking with his father, it was Zev Begin, and the Dayan of Brisk, Reb Simcha Zelig. And a Polish officer came over and slapped Reb Simcha Zelig in the face. And Zev Begin couldn't tolerate that. And he hit this Polish officer, and he ran away. So Simcha Zelig said, "Was tust du? What are you doing? You're putting us all at risk. He said, "No, I wasn't going to let him get away with it." Covered Torah. And Menachem Begin said, standing next to his father at that day, that's where he learned to fight back, to be strong, to be the gibor that he was for Klal Yisrael. Another story that he told me was about a visit that the Pnei Menachem, this was before he became Rebbe, had with the Rav. Pnei Menachem came up to the campus at YU and went to visit the Rav. As I recall, as Rabbi Schonfeld tells it, Pnei Menachem was quoting Reb Chaim's, and I think the Rav was quoting his Sfas Emes. And they were so engaged in learning, and you could see the camaraderie between them. And of course, as was mentioned before, Rabbi Schonfeld was a Geschworene Gera in the sense he would always have his Sfas Emes up his sleeve. And he said, as the Pnei Menachem was leaving, he saw the boys there in Danziger campus and they're playing basketball, and just stopped. He wanted just to observe it. He says, he was saying to himself, "I wish we could do that also, but sort of demurred, but we can't." Another story that Rabbi Schonfeld told me was somebody once came. Rabbi Schonfeld brought somebody to meet the Rav, and this person had renovated Reb Chaim's restored Reb Chaim's kever in Varsha. Reb Chaim is buried next to the Nesiv, and Rabbi Schonfeld introduced this person to the Rav, saying, he had restored your grandfather's kever, and the Rav listened, and then when this person left, afterwards, Rabbi Schonfeld asked the Rav, "I thought, you'd be so much more enthusiastic about it, that he had restored Reb Chaim's kever." And Rabbi Schonfeld said, the Rav said, "Yes, but I don't know if it's such a big mitzvah to, to make it, to give money to our Sonim in Poland, just to accommodate them in terms of getting more people for tourists to come. Another story Rabbi Schonfeld told me, also revolving around the Rav, was apparently Rabbi Schonfeld had a car, and this was in the early years. I'm not sure in what years this was. Sometimes, maybe it was in the early 50s. And he used to, on occasion, drive the Rav around. And the Rav used to collect money for different stuckers. One of them was for brisk. I assume this was for Velvel in his time. And Rabbi Schonfeld took the Rav asked him to take him to some very wealthy person living on the west side of Manhattan. And this fellow, while he was there, asked the Rav a shaila. And the Rav was thinking, and he said, "Bring me a Rambam." And the man doesn't move. So the Rav says again, "Bring me a Rambam." So the man had to red-faced admit that he doesn't own a Rambam. And the Rav looked at him in absolute astonishment. Vi lebt Yid on a Rambam. So all these stories tell us something about Rabbi Schonfeld. First of all, it wasn't just a coincidence that he's the one who took Menachem Begin. Rabbi Schonfeld had a deep, deep love of Eretz Yisrael, and he was involved in Eretz Yisrael, in religious Zionism, but dealing with people of the leadership at the highest level. And that's because they trusted him and they respected him. That he's the one who brought the Pnei Menachem to see the Rav wasn't also a coincidence, but he had this deep relationship with different Admorim, especially with Ger, but beyond Ger, because people knew that Rabbi Schonfeld was a builder and a man of commitment and loyalty. And that he was the one driving the Rav around as his confidant and chauffeur in those early years was because the Rav trusted him, indeed loved him. And I saw up close, when I first came to the OU, Rabbi Schonfeld played an important role, a critical role in the RCA, and especially in the Kashrus Commission. And he was always there for high standards and the RCA's engagement. He would speak to me till the last few years, even, that, there've been a Kashrus Commission sort of atrophied and it's not functioning. We've got to get them back. Frankly, just for me, it's always easier to make the decision alone. But, on a communal level, he was right. And his communal involvement, his Torah involvement. I remember this must have been approximately 1968 or 1969. We had begun, after the Rav's wife passed away, the Rav started giving shurim in the summer. It started in Onset, which is in Buzzards Bay, the edge of the Cape Cod. And there was a small group, less than 10 of us that went up. But the next year, the Rav switched the shurim to Boston, to Brookline. And after he first gave shurim for us, I think that was the year of Harius, and the next year was Nazir, Rabbi Schonfeld had organized that the Rabbanim should come up afterwards for about 3 or 4 days. And it was completely his initiative. He would introduce the Rav, he took care of it, and it meant a lot to the Rav. Those are the shurim that the Rav gave the Achikala. So Rabbi Schonfeld really, his accomplishments, he really strode hard, made extraordinary accomplishments in terms of the American Jewish scene on many, many different levels, in terms of education, in terms of the community, the Young Israel, in terms of the Rabbinical Council, the OU, and especially his very, very special relationship that he had with the Rav. He was a person of excellence, of integrity, true friendship. And I used to enjoy, in the last several years, I used to ask Joey, Rabbi Schonfeld, if I can go visit his father, just to schmooze. And of course, very often it would come back to discussions about the yeshiva in the early days, and especially about the Rav. He was an exceptionally special person, and he will be very, very missed. But his legacy, his very rich legacy, will live on through his family and through his many accomplishments forever.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Genek. Having heard from two of the great leaders of the in the rabbinic world, it's appropriate that we next hear from Malcolm Hoenlein, and Mr. Hoenlein is one of the Gedolim in terms of askanos, in terms of our political actions on behalf of the community. And my grandfather was very, very deeply involved with the President's Conference that was under Mr. Hoenlein's tutelage for so many years. I met the conference and Mr. Hoenlein for the very first time as a yeshiva bacher in the Hyatt in Yerushalayim, because there was a conference going on at the time, and my grandparents were in town, and the only way for me to see them was to go to the President's Conference. They were not going to come to yeshiva to see me. And they had just gotten back from meeting King Hussein in Jordan. It was an eye-opening evening for me. And in any event, on that note, I'll ask Mr. Hoenlein to share a few words.
Thank you. So I will address perhaps other aspects of Schonfeld Zatzal's legacy. I got to know him soon after my arrival in New York, when I came to start the New York Conference on Soviet Jewry. I had known of him while I was still in Philadelphia and was anxious to get to meet him. Few today remember the vital role he played in the Soviet Jewry movement. He was active both through his local Queen's Council on Soviet Jewry and through several of the national organizations. Because of his personal history, this cause, the saving of Jews from the former Soviet Union then, had very special meaning. He was someone who walked the walk. He attended demonstrations and was amongst a few of the Orthodox rabbis who helped create the Soviet Jewry movement. My contact with him in the early 1970s began a relationship that lasted 5 decades. I could not have had the zchus to find a better Rav, a better friend, and a better mentor. European-born and cultured, a Gerer Chassid, among the closest Talmidim of Rav Ber Soloveitchik, he embodied and was a model, I think, of Torah Derech Eretz. And yesterday, having been the yahrzeit of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, it's appropriate to remember the influence it had on him in discussions we often had about that tradition. He struck a remarkable balance. As a true Talmid Chacham, he believed and lived Kol Yisrael Arevim. He did not hyphenate Jews, but saw Klal Yisrael as Am Echad B'Lev Echad. His midos, his Bein Adam L'Chabero attributes were striking and enabled him to affect so many as a Rav, a community builder, a manig, an orator, a teacher, a Moreh Derech, a counselor. He was a builder of Two Garden Hills, of the Young Israel, and encouraged other synagogues to grow there as well. Of the conference, JCRC, the OU, the RCA, the National Council, Polei Aguda, and so many other Jewish organizations and causes. For 7 decades, he was at the forefront of every cause of Klal Yisrael. By example and instruction, he created many leaders of our community. Whenever over the years I faced a difficult and delicate situation in which key leaders struggled over a core religious issue, there were only a couple of people I knew I could call upon to engage with them and was assured a positive outcome. Rabbi Schonfeld led that list. He was a diplomat par excellence. On learning of his patira, many of the leaders from years past commented to me about their admiration, appreciation, and respect for him. Many told of discussions with him after meetings or at events of the conference. His patience, his intelligence, his knowledge, his understanding were constantly cited by them. His self-effacing style, his engaging personality, his openness were as evident as his strict adherence to his Masorah. He could become a strong advocate and stood his ground if he felt fundamental interests of Israel were jeopardized or Torah values were challenged, but always with a hadras panim that won people over to his view. Not ego or aggrandizement drove him, but his personal commitment to Torah Yisrael, Am Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael. As the Rav wrote, a Torah teacher is freely accepted and joyfully embraced. His authority emerges not from fear but affection, and respect motivates one's submission. A teacher is a master like a king. At times, he inspires emulation of his way of thinking and his general deportment, but this does not result in the enslavement of his disciples. They are encouraged to grow for their total personality. That was the derech that Rabbi Schonfeld followed himself. It was reflected as he carried the torch of Poalei Agudas Yisrael for many years and sustained it as others drifted away. He was a true Ohev Shalom and Rodev Shalom, and was an Ohev Asabrios who was Makavan Torah so many, whether in his shul, his community, or far beyond. He and the Rebbitzin opened their house, their hearts, to so many. He would fight for kashrus in the community so that people could live there, and those who needed a parnasa, for the young and those who were alone. He involved them all, having them to his home, and every year remembered that Yizkor on Shavuos, all of those who would help build the shul, so that people remember that we are where we are because of the contributions of those who preceded us. He also earned universal respect in his involvements beyond the narrow bounds of Jewish life. He was a leader in the Synagogue Council of America's Interreligious Affairs Committee, this at the behest of the Rav, and in the International Jewish Community Interreligious Council, IJKIC, which he led and played such a critical role in for so many years. He has inspired his non-Jewish interlocutors and gained support for Israel and our communal agenda. The cardinal held him in high esteem, and popes welcomed him, as did political leaders in the United States and Israel. I cannot recall an instance when a bad word was said about him, an unusual feat in Jewish life. He took nothing and no one for granted and appreciated every gesture. Recently, when I visited him, he greeted me so warmly, even excited. He wanted to know what was happening in my family, the conference, and overall in the community. The last time I came to see him, I saw people arriving at the end of our meeting, and he finally told me they were coming for a shiur. He remained a teacher until his last days. His drushes would offer simultaneously a moral lesson, musar, halacha, a makar, some history, always a message. And he would apply the same skills when speaking to the president's conference or interacting with national and international figures. I feel his loss greatly. I remember the chesed nurayach that he provided when, as a very young person, I came to New York and did not know many people, and most were skeptical that we could actually build a Soviet Jewry movement. And his friendship sustained over these 5 decades. His experience in the secular world and in Hasidus, in the Beis Medrash and the halls of power, his knowledge of the past and vision for the future, his respect for every Jew and every person made him a role model as a Jewish leader. He was a leader who inspired others to lead, to understand, to come together. I miss his advice, his keen observations and wisdom, which so affected my life and that of countless others. Yehi zichro baruch.
Thank you very much for those beautiful words, Mr. Honlein. One of the more overused Mishnayos in Pirkei Avos is a Selech Harav Uknei Lecha Chaver, but in the case of Rabbi Leonard Matanki, the rabbi in Kins in Chicago, my personal favorite shul when I have occasion to visit there, and Rabbi Matanki is always so warm to me. But it certainly applied to him and his relationship with my grandfather, and we will never forget how when our family was sitting Shiva for my grandmother, Rabbi Matanki flew in from Chicago just to be Menachem Avel on my grandfather, a true Yedid Nefesh, former president of the RCA himself, and it is my great comfort to call upon Rabbi Matanki to say a few words.
Thank you. I am a relative newcomer among those speaking today. I didn't know Rabbi Schonfeld at the height of his influence. I wasn't a member of the Queens community when he built Kew Gardens Hills. I'm more than a generation younger. His teachers were not my teachers. And while he was from Vienna, London, and New York, I'm a Chicagoan, who in the parlance of most New Yorkers makes me an out-of-towner. True, his daughter Georgie and I were in Bnei Akiva together, and Vicky and I shared students that I sent her way And Debbie and I live nearby, and her children are members of my shul. But until less than 15 years ago, I didn't know Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld Zatzal except through his reputation as one of the most eloquent spokesmen for orthodoxy, as a great Talmud and confidant of the Rav, and as a leader of the Poalei Agudas Yisrael, the Rabbinical Council of America, Young Israel, the Soviet Jewry movement, and so many other causes. His name was distinctive, and he was distinguished, and that was all I knew. But through a fortuitous turn of events, when I became more involved with the Rabbinical Council of America, all of that changed. And I grew to know Rabbi Schonfeld as a mentor, as a bridge to tradition and generations past, and most of all, as a person who, despite the many differences in our backgrounds, I could look to tell it to me straight. As such, Rabbi Schonfeld was, for me, the personification of all three segments of the Mishnah, which taught us, he was a person I could look towards for insight and advice, and he never failed to share it, sometimes when I didn't even ask. But in that sense, he was my Rav, and he was a person of great loyalty, willing to step forward for me as he did for countless other Rabbanim who needed his support. But he was also willing to tell me when I was wrong, sometimes when I wished he wouldn't, which is what a chaver is supposed to do. And he gave everyone the benefit of the doubt, suggesting that those who may have been too lenient with halacha were suffering from too much avas Yisrael, and those who were too strict with halacha may have been living lives that were too sheltered, not understanding the needs of amcha, of simple balabatim, as he had worked with and he had raised up, which may have been the reason that so very often, whether on committee calls or in personal conversations, Rabbi Schonfeld would catch us off guard with his opinion. We thought we knew what had to be done, and then he would weigh in, often, as you've heard, with a story about the Rav or a vort from the Ger Rebbe, and recommend a totally different approach. And while I didn't always agree, when Rabbi Schonfeld spoke, it was with an added measure of gravitas that had to be considered, because Rabbi Schonfeld carried with him not only a lifetime of experience, but a lifetime of success. He was a Rav who would engage teenagers around his Shabbos table before there was an NCSY or youth directors at shuls. He was a Rav who not only didn't feel threatened when new shuls arose in his community, but who welcomed them in. He was a Rav who was the quintessential Talmud of Yeshiva University, but who welcomed other yeshivas to open and urged us to recruit their musmachim into our ranks. And he was a Rav who selflessly gave all of his time to others, and yet never lacked the time to be the most loving husband and father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. Therefore, he was a Rav we admired, cherished, and looked up to, because he was not only at home in the four walls of a beis medrash, but in the community at large. And so he was the one to represent our community at a national political convention. He was the one who Rav Soloveitchik entrusted, as you heard, to represent our community with IJKIC, the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. He was our man on the Conference of Presidents, and the one who could pick up the phone and speak to the halls of power. In this week's Parsha, when Moshe and Aaron are instructed regarding the Jewish people, v'yitzavem el bnei Yisrael, the Medrash notes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu warned them that leadership would not be an easy task and that they would encounter many obstacles along the way. Nevertheless, tzaveh alehem lanigam b'nachat ulispolotam. God commanded them to bear the burden and lead them calmly. Said the Beis Yisrael, that this command serves as a lesson to every Jew to lead benachas, calmly despite the challenges and despite them to try and try again, kilevasof yishma v'yikabel, because ultimately they will listen and they will follow. For 7 decades, Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld successfully led his community in our Jewish world. And over those years and before, there were countless obstacles that HaKadosh Baruch Hu placed in his way, difficult personal losses and contentious communal conflicts. But throughout it all, Rabbi Schonfeld stayed the course with determination and resolve. And as a result, he was zochet to preside over a community that not only grew, but thrived, creating future communal leaders, Rabbanim and Balabatim, who learned from his example and understood kilevasof yishma v'yikabel. Over the past year, we've lost many great Jewish leaders. And just this week, I'm observing the Shloshim for Harav Gedalia Dov Schwartz Zatzal, with whom I was very close. My wife's father, my father-in-law Zal, who was like a father to me, and Rabbi Schonfeld Zatzal. Each loss was so very painful. But when I heard of Rabbi Schonfeld's passing, I felt it in a very different way that I didn't understand. I didn't understand it until I was preparing these thoughts for today and remembered a phrase found at the end of the story of Choni Amagal. Absent friends and colleagues, Choni proclaimed, O Chavruta, O Mituta, that he couldn't live without friends. I, Baruch Hashem, have many friends and colleagues who I can rely upon, among them Rabbi Yoel Schonfeld Shlita. And yet, while it's true that Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld was a great Rav, when he passed away, I, as did many of us, also lost a great friend, a person I would regularly call just to stay in touch and who would take my calls, even when he may not have felt well. A person I admired, a person who I learned from, and a person who represented the finest values of Jewish leadership, Avas Yisrael and Yiras Shamayim, and a person I could confide in, a chaver, a true friend in the greatest sense of the word, who can never be replaced. Because of this, even in his final years when confined to a wheelchair or a bed, Rabbi Schonfeld stood taller than most. He welcomed everyone, no matter their practices or beliefs, as he lived a life, as the Rav wrote, in consonance with his convictions, guided by Torah and filled with Avodas Hashem. And because of that, Rabbi Fabian Schonfeld changed the world through his faith, his warmth, his determination, and his eloquence. May the entire Schonfeld family find comfort in the knowledge that their patriarch, Rav Mordechai Shraga Feivel ben Shmuel Shabsai Halevi Zatzal, lived a life not only of Arichut Shanim, but Arichut Yamim, that he was admired and cherished, and that his work continues in the hands and the hearts of a myriad of Talmidim, and especially his Chaverim.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you for those beautiful words. And our final speaker today is my cousin Rick Schindelheim, representing the grandchildren, and each one of us could speak, and each one of us would have a different story to tell. Rick is currently a Rebbe in the Fuchs Mizrahi in Cleveland, and he was a great source of pride to my grandfather. They would, as Rick grew up and developed into an adult, his relationship with my grandfather developed, and they had a great mutual love and respect for each other as grandfather and grandson, but also almost as Rebbe and Talmud. And so Rick has a perspective, a unique perspective, just as each one of us does in our own way. So I now call upon Rick Schindelheim, my cousin.
Rishus Avimori, Rabbanim Chashuvim, my aunts and uncles, my brothers and sister, B'nai Dodim Yikarim. On the occasion of Rav Soloveitchik's 20th yahrzeit, my grandfather Zatzal came to Yeshiva, to Lamport Auditorium, and spoke about his Rebbe, the Rav. As he began speaking, my grandfather expressed his emotions at that moment by quoting from the Shliach Tzibor on the Yamim Noraim. Hineni haoni mimas nirash v'nifchad. Behold, I'm impoverished of deeds, quivering in fear. Mi anochi, he asked. Who am I to speak about such a giant? And if my grandfather felt this way, then alachas kama v'kama. Mi anochi, who am I now to speak of Morenu's Kanenu, Grandpa, Abba Zaidi, Zaidi Jr.? When I ask myself that question, who am I? I'm reminded of the Gemara in Psachim Daf Samach Ches Amud Beis. On the holiday of Shavuos, Rav Yosef would have an elaborate feast to celebrate the Torah. He would say, Ilav hayoma de kagarim kama Yosef ika beshuka. If not for this special day, I'd be no more than any old Yosef found in the street. Who am I? Ilav hay saba de kagarim kama ben Yosef ika beshuka. Whoever I am, whatever worthiness I have, is because of my grandfather. At that Rav Soloveitchik Yortzeit event, someone commented to my brothers and me that they were so impressed by the kavod we showed to our grandfather and the way we accompanied him around campus. But the truth is that being his grandson, and I know I can say this for the entire family, the kavod was always ours. For my brothers and me to have the zechus to help him around the yeshiva campus, the yeshiva we shared with him, was like walking with a Hall of Famer around Yankee Stadium, or maybe I should say Shea or Citi Field, sorry, Simcha. But being his grandchild felt like being a member of a royal family. It was our kavod, our zechus. In the past month, after hearing the Hespedim and reading the articles that have been written about the greatness of my grandfather, I've been struggling with the question of, what can I add that hasn't been said? As my grandfather always used to ask me, my chiddush al b'beis medrash. I'm worried that I don't have any earth-shattering revelations to share about him. But then it occurred to me that perhaps he gufa, that's precisely the point. He was the ultimate tocho kevaro. What he spoke about in his drashos and shul is what he spoke about at the Shabbos table. He stood from his pulpit and told his congregants that they needed to be invested in their children's and grandchildren's Torah learning. He held himself to that standard. My cousins and siblings can all relate to the experience of coming up that narrow stairway in the house. You knew exactly what you were going to get. First, a make-up-y kiss, a piece of kugel, and probably a cheap toy from grandma. And second, a quiz on what you were learning in school from grandpa, Mishnayos, Parsha, Gemara, whatever it was. Many people have discussed at length this closeness with Rav Soloveitchik. I won't elaborate here as it's already been said today, and my cousin Shabi has elaborated so eloquently at the Levaya. I'll just add that I remember the Shabbos after they published the Sefer of the Rav's Drashos in Yiddish. Grandpa got a copy, and he was like a child playing with a brand new toy. He wouldn't put it down. My grandmother asked him if he was going to take a nap that Shabbos afternoon, and he said, no, I think I'll spend some time with my Sfarim. When someone found recordings of the Rav's Shiurim and played them, he started crying upon hearing the voice of his Rebbe teaching Torah once again. He used to ask me with sincere angst in his voice, do they still talk about the Rav in the yeshiva? Of course, I'd say. No, but does he really still shape the yeshiva? He'd press. Can you still feel his presence in the Beis Medrash? What I'm trying to say is that all the wonderful and moving things that have been said about him are not exaggerations, and some of them are perhaps understatements. The Rabbi Schonfeld the world loved and admired was the same Rabbi Schonfeld at his kitchen table. But consistency is not always the word that comes to mind when one thinks of my grandfather. At times, it even seemed like his life was a stira minei ubei, an internal contradiction. After all, he was Rabbi Fabian, the Wayu Musmach, Talmud of Rav Soloveitchik, and simultaneously, Rav Mordechai Shraga Feivel from Vienna, the Chassid of the Ger Rebbes. His worldview so heavily influenced by Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and he was also an ardent religious Zionist. Was this man not a walking Tarti Desasri? But in reality, of course, there was no contradiction, no shtei ksuvim hamakchishim zeh zeh. Grandpa was the kosev ashlishi amachriya beinehem, that third verse masterfully harmonizing between competing values. How did he manage to do this so effectively? By never losing sight of his priorities and never losing his sense of humor. My grandfather told me that on one Shabbos in the bungalow colony when he was davening in the Satmar Minyan, he got an aliyah. And after his aliyah, he made a Misha Beirach for Dina Bas Yisrael. After the minyan, the Gabbai came to him and asked him, who's this Dina Bas Yisrael? You never mentioned that name before. My grandfather said, oh no, I didn't say Dina Bas Yisrael. I said Medinas Yisrael. Needless to say, the Gabbai was not pleased. But aside from being satisfied with his cleverness, I think Grandpa liked doing things like that because it was his way of saying we can disagree without being so intense. We can still daven together. We can still talk with each other. We can even laugh together. Of all the Torah he quoted from the Rav, one of the things I heard him repeat most often was the Rav always taught us, you disagree with the idea, you don't attack the person. I think the fact that he repeated this so often says a lot about who he was. At the same time, we all know about his passion and his convictions, how unwavering and uncompromising he was on his principles. Yet he wouldn't use that as an excuse to attack people personally. Aluvin ve'enan ne'elavin, ve'enan olvin, as he loved to quote. He found that balance. This notion of navigating contradictions wasn't just true of his hashkafa, his worldview. It was true in his personal life as well. He experienced so much suffering from the time he was a boy and throughout his life, and yet his hakaras hatov and emunah in the Ribono Shel Olam never wavered. How many times would he have been more than justified in turning towards the heaven and saying, "Nu tate shoin genug, enough is enough. This isn't fair." But all I ever heard from him was hakaras hatov, for marrying grandma, for the family, even his famous tefillin story. I was always struck by the fact that he chose to focus on the Austrian conductor who saved his tefillin and not the Nazi who threw them in the trash. He chose to emphasize the nace of how he got out of Austria and made it onto the kinder transport, when he could have easily harped on the depressing reality of being stabbed by a childhood friend and being driven from his home. He was so protective of my grandmother, Alea Shalom, and was always fearful of her pushing herself too much. And yet when he was well into his 80s, he was still giving multiple shiurim each week. In his 90s, he still sat at the table with the Rolodex and his well-worn Shulchan Aruch, making endless numbers of phone calls to check in on congregants or getting himself riled up about the burning issues in the RCA. But of course, he would say there was no stira. He was never exempt and could never retire from being osek b'tzorchei tzibor. Within the family itself, how could one person be Abba, Daddy, Grandpa, v'chule, to so many people who didn't share genes? A few years ago at our Aunt Giselle's Levaya, my grandfather expressed his hakaras hatov. Again, he was so makbid on that midah. He said, I have to thank Giselle for removing the word step from our family's vocabulary. And it's not an exaggeration. In our family, steps are only for hanging pictures. And not only that, but as my cousin Yossi Shapiro noted at the Levaya, their in-laws were their children too. Ad kidei kach, that they would confuse people by saying things like, this is my grandson Rick and my granddaughter Lou. They're Yossis. They just got married. There was nothing contradictory about it though. As I heard him say more than once, they are all my children that God has given me. My grandfather was fond of quoting the Gemara in Moed Katan that teaches, based on the words of the prophet Malachi, V'Torah yivakshu mipiu ki malach Hashem tzivakosu. Im dome harav l'malach Hashem yivakshu Torah mipiv. You shall seek Torah from his mouth, for he is an angel of the Lord. Says the Gemara, if the Rav is similar to an angel of the Lord, then you seek Torah from his mouth. It seems strange to say, seek Torah from his mouth. Why not yivakish Torah mimenu? Seek Torah from him. Why mipihu? Perhaps this refers not to the Torah that he teaches in a traditional capacity, but mipihu refers to that which we learn from his everyday speech, his sichas chulin, the way he interacts with others, the way he carries himself. I've learned much traditional Torah from my grandfather, but I and all of us have learned a great deal mipihu, from his role modeling as well. There are so many examples, but time only permits a few. Firstly, the way he related to his brother, Uncle Bibi, Zichrono Livracha, was not only heartwarming, but instructional. He was so loving, caring, and inclusive. He would brag about Uncle Bibi, how he's a doctor and a Talmid Chacham. He was makbid on his brother's kavod. He taught us how to be better siblings, and he often told us outright to be nicer siblings, especially to my sister Ari. Second, the way he experienced Torah learning was worthy of emulation. Torah was literally chayav v'orach yamav. Whenever I would call, almost without exception, no matter how sick or weak he was, if we talked in learning, he would perk up. Just this past Motzei Shabbos Shuva, I called him to tell him about a shir I gave. I told him that I quoted a Gemara in Shabbos and a vor he taught me, but I forgot who said it. I guessed it was the Sfas Emes playing the odds. He said it's the Meiri and it's on Gittin Lamed Vav, not Shabbos, but very good, very nice. He didn't just teach us Torah, he taught us how to approach Torah. He taught us how to love Torah. But perhaps most of all that I learned mipihu was from the kind of husband he was to my grandma. Their relationship was a paradigm of re'im ahuvim, best of friends still after almost 60 years. The way he spoke to and about grandma was a model of the kind of husband I aspire to be. Selfishly, a part of me wishes that grandma were here now to comfort us, to tell us stories, to kvel over Grandpa and say things like, oh, he was so handsome, or oh, he was such a Talmid Chacham. But on the other hand, it feels almost like in his final act of chivalry, he bore the agony of living without her for the past few years so that it didn't have to be the other way around. I'll conclude by paraphrasing my grandfather's closing words at the Rav's 20th Yortzeit. May we be zocha to live the way Grandpa wanted us to live, the way he taught us to live with his words and with his actions. Yehi Zichro Baruch.
Rick, thank you so much for those very, very beautiful and moving words. I'm sure many of us say that you speak on our behalf as well and echo your sentiments. And on that, Rick is the final speaker. And with that, we conclude. I just want to thank all of those who spoke today, all of those who joined us today. It's difficult to end this program at all, but we have concluded, and may my grandfather's memory and his legacy remain with us, his legacy of leadership, his legacy of Hanhaga, his legacy of being both a leader and a follower, and all the other lessons that he taught may continue to be a Me'elat Yosher for us, for our family, for his extended family, for all of Klal Yisrael. Yehi Zichro Baruch.